WBRN Radio and on the Bostonred Network. The Numbers Man Division, which is our macroeconomics program called This Week in Economics. And this episode is the 17th of February 2020. Numbers Man here, and as normally we do this broadcast with Cranston Analytics. Very interesting situation the past few days have occurred. The center, actually there are two centers, but we'll start with the first center. The COVID-19 virus, its effects on the global economic well-being. And in China, looking at my notes here, and this is an extended version, so some of the information goes a little beyond. There are roughly 17,000 people infected in China, and out of that, 58,000 active cases. There are 1,900 have died at least in China. 760 million people are under some type of lockdown in China, which basically means both factories are closed. People can't go to work. People are confined to their quarters, wherever they are, and starting to get estimates of lost GDP. Now, this would be in Q1, which we're in now, and it could extend to Q2. And if it extends to Q3, there are big problems entering. Anyway, some of the consensus by some economists from 1 to 3% decline in GDP. We've been looking at this, and of course 1% at one time was where we saw things, but now it is more like about 2% at the present time of GDP. Now, the second rail of this particular situation, we'll talk about it, is Japan. The third largest economy has been in some contraction. We have the latest figures here. I believe it's, I don't have my notes, but it's, 6.2, the contraction. We'll have it anyway, from the Foreign Ministry of Japan. And we have industrial and production capacity figures from the Federal Reserve, which were released on the 14th. And also, and we don't have the data on this, but we had retail sales somewhere here at 0.03, I believe, was in January. But we'll be looking also at consumer credit, and that is from the, I believe, New York Fed here, and where it is. Now, this is interesting in that we have a virus that's in the same family of viruses, coronavirus, that we had SARS and we had MERS was in that family, but they have named it COVID-19, which is a name for the particular virus, and it has managed to appear in various nations, not as in China. The only other outbreak, I guess you'd say, is on the ship, the Diamond, Princess, I think. And the U.S. has evacuated people from it. The Canadians, the Koreans, in fact, the Koreans sent a presidential plane to evacuate their small number of people. The Israelis are sending medical workers to Japan. In fact, they're going to use a robot to do temperatures. So we're getting into some robotics into the mix as far as examining people, and some of the U.S. people from that ship have arrived in California and in Texas, and some are at a facility, which is a quarantine facility in Nebraska, where they are taking measures there with people with more serious infections, and so this sort of goes on. And one of the big problems here, we are approaching the latter part of February. going into March, perhaps even into April. And so you have January, February and March, that's Q1, and you start getting into Q2. But with Japan and its downturn coming in here, there's been some commentary on it, what will happen in the next quarter. That'd be Q2 in Japan. And technically, economists would peg a downturn or a recession at 2 consecutive quarters. I would comment on that. It has changed somewhat, and the reason for the change is that central banks have a number of tools that they can use, including quantitative easing. We haven't seen too much of that. It used to be called in the old days by the Keynesians as pump priming. Well, that is an instrument there, and also interest rates can go up and down. And that is, we'll also have at the end of this a report to Congress by Chairman Powell. He was testifying at the House. That's a committee that is chaired by Maxine Waters of Los Angeles. In fact, that is part of the mandated testimony. There will be another one of those mandated called Humphrey Hawkins. It was named after the office, Representative Hawkins of Los Angeles, and the late Senator also Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota. So it mandates that the federal chair appear before the Congress for an annual report, and the dual missions of the Federal Reserve, maximum employment, and the overseeing of inflation in the economy there. And you'll hear from Chairman Powell on that particular situation as we move by. Another indication we have in the supply chain, incidentally mentioned it, that Apple, the maker of the phone and various other products, their quarter will be less than it should have been. And they, in other words, they will take a hit. And we have a lot of economic in B, whatever it is, BC, I think it is. Anyway, the Swiss bank lost about 33%. They are off about 33%. They will lay off about 3,500 workers in counting. So you have a number of developments that are coming out of this are related to it. One of the big problems here is that in the U.S., without the tax cuts and various other measures, the decrease in interest rate, those provide an artificiality to the economy. And when you have that type of situation, you, from a forecasting standpoint, you are left in a quarry, basically speaking, of the increased shepherding and tools used by central banks. In China, they have put some money into the economy. That is to be seen because of the type of crisis that they have. And it also puts a spotlight on their healthcare system in China. But it could be on any healthcare system if you look at the number of people that have to have attention at hospitals, surgeries, etc. How many beds do you have given that particular situation? So China is going to have to upgrade some procedures and upgrade their medical system, and that will go to a number of countries. The World Health Organization is already talking about getting money for various emerging countries on the African continent and other places to upgrade their health care systems, because with global travel, a person can board a plane in Beijing and be in New York in a matter of hours, or from wherever. And the virus can travel with that person and go to a third party that is there, and there's a lot they do not know. There's a World Health team on the ground in China, and you have to realize China is a vast country, over a billion people. No other country in the world has that type of situation to deal with, and there are other countries, India for instance. The medical system is not as advanced as China's, and if you look at some of the equipment they have there, they have very modern equipment, but they have to deal with how they're doing it in terms of diagnostics. Now, in particular of temperatures, they're using CAT scans, which in themselves are not welcome unless absolutely necessary. So those are some of the caveats there. And in let's see where else. In Korea, the Korean government started to take action because they are part of the supply chain. And that's going to mean that a lot of products that are in that supply chain, especially since the way that products are done these days in terms of on-time or real-time warehousing, etc., there's usually not that backlog of products that we had at one time. And changing a location takes months. So you have situations where some auto plants are closed. Now some other plants in China actually now are going full stream, and I would suspect that those plants are places where workers live within walking of the production centers, but that's only my guess. Anyway, nonetheless, let's go to the Federal Reserve, and we'll look at the figures here, and then we'll continue to move around a little bit here. Industrial production declined 0.3% in January, as unseasonably warm weather held down the output of utilities, and major manufacturers significantly slowed civilian aircraft. In fact, the aircraft maker in Canada, Bombardier, is in bankruptcy, is selling parts of itself to various people, European ordinary companies, and they're selling their. They also make freight trains, and they are selling that to I believe, a French company. And the only thing they'll be left with, Bombardier, will be their private aircraft part. They'll be left with that. The problem there is in the Ottawa, the government there has put millions of dollars, of Canadian dollars, into that in Quebec government, I should say, into that enterprise. So that is some of the things that's going on. Let me finish. The index for manufacturing edged down 1/10% in January, excluding production of aircraft or parts and factory outputs. Now, one of the things, Boeing is still down. In the latest estimates there, some of the major aircraft carriers will not be using their product for at least the bulk of the summer. So that is what the situation is right now. So let's look at industrial production here. These are summaries here. The index, we're at 109.2 in January 2020. We were at 109.9 in August of 2019. And we go to December of 2019, we were at 109.5. So sort of in the percentage change here, negative 0.3 in January 2020. Major market groups, final product, 102 was in 2020. Consumer goods at 104.6. In August of 2019, it was 105.5. Business equipment in January was 98.5. In August, it was 101.7. Non-industrial supplies were at 109, and it was 108.5 in August of 19. Construction was 117 in August, and it is at 118.9 in January. Materials at 115.6 in August, and it's 115.3 there. So in other words, that's a percentage change of negative 0.310. The major industrial groups are manufacturing at 104.9. That's the index. It was 105.2 in August. And mining at 133.7 in August. It's 136.2 in 2020. Utilities had fallen. They were 104.6 in August at 98 in January. Percentage change that is negative 4. And if we won't get in previous estimate, we will get into crude because we're going to talk about oil production in the Dakotas, shale there, and its probability or non-probability. We'll get to that later in the broadcast here. Anyway, crude was at in the average from 1972 to 2019 was 80.6. In January, it was 88.6. 2020 capacity at 3.19. So the percentage change was this is unfinished at 1.6. The index for mining rose, and this is a summary here of 1.2, and at 109.2 temps. Of its 2012 average. Total industrial production was 8 tenths percentage lower in January than a year earlier. Capacity utilization for the industrial sector fell 3 tenths percentage points in January to 76.8. But the rate is 3 percentage points below the long running, and I think we went over this 1972 to 2019. Major markets groups, we won't go back over that, but manufacturing output decreased 0.1% in January to a level of 8 tenths below its year earlier reading. The production of durable goods moved down 5 tenths in January as a drop for aerospace and miscellaneous transportation equipment for machinery was partially offset by a gain for motor vehicles and parts. The output of non-durable manufacturing rose 3 tenths. Almost all of the component categories posted gains. The index for petroleum and coal products for plastics, rubber products recorded an increase of more than 1%, whereas the only index for apparel and leather products recorded a decrease of more than 1%. Mining advanced 1.2% and stood at 3.1% above its level a year earlier. The output utilities fell 4%, with electricity and natural gas posting declines, and this is due to climatic conditions at 3.2% and 7.7%, so natural gas took a bath. That was very good there. Anyway, capacity utilization for manufacturing edged down 1/10% in January to 71.1. And sorry about the redundancy here, but the utility rate for mining rose to 90.7, well above its long-running 87.2. Operating rate for utilities at 70.6%. The rate is 15 percentage points below its long-running average. So this is where utilities are, and we won't get into capacity here, but basically you see the Federal Reserve plans to issue its annual revision to the index of industrial production and related measurements of capacity utilization in this summer of 2020. The split index will be updated information from its benchmark 2012 index, input-output accounts from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So you see all these operations together here. The Census Bureau quarter survey of plant capacity, along with new data capabilities from the U.S. Geological Survey, the U.S. Department of Energy, and other organizations. They're all working together here. So let's run along here like we know what we're doing. And okay, we'll get to credit. Now this is from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Aggregated household debt balance increased to $193 billion. That's in Q4 of last year. A 1.4 increase, and now stands at 14.15 trillion. The balance has been steadily rising for 5 years in the aggregate, and now at 1.5 trillion higher in normal terms than the previous peak, and that was in Q3 of 2008. The peak there was $12.68 trillion. That was when the Depression came. All household debt is now at 26.8, above the 2013 Q2 trough there. Mortgage balances, we always look at that on consumer balance, shows consumer credit reports. That was in December, stood at 9.56 trillion, a 120 billion increase from 2019, the third quarter. Balances on home equity credits stood at a 6 billion decline, bringing the outstanding balance to 390 billion and continuing the 10-year downward trend. Non-housing balance increased by 79 billion in Q4, with an increase across the board, including 16 billion auto loans, 46 billion in credit card balances, 10 billion in student loans, which has become part of the 2020 campaign. Note that a large increase in a credit card balance reflects in part a shifting of balances across debt types as portfolios have shifted amongst lenders. New extension of credit was strong in the fourth quarter. Auto loan originators, which include both newly opened loans and leases at 159 billion, were about flat with previous quarter highs. Mortgage originations, which we measure as appearances of new mortgage balance on consumer credit reports, which include refinancing, were at 752 billion, a large increase from 528 billion. That was in Q3. The largest volume in origination since the end of 2005. Aggregated credit limits on credit cards also increased by 96 billion, continuing a 12-year upward trend. Credit standards tightened slightly again in the Q4. The medium credit score for newly originating borrowers increased in Q4 for mortgages to 770. That's a 5-point increase from the third quarter, reflecting a high share of refinancing. Auto loans also saw tightening in underwriting standards, with a 4-point increase in medium originating credit scores. The volume of subprime auto loan origination was at 31 billion, a new level on par with the last several years. Aggregated delinquency rates were almost unchanged in Q4. As of December, 31.4 where outstanding debt was in some stage of delinquency, a 0.1% decrease from the third quarter due to increase in the 30 to 60 day late bracket. Anyway, 669 billion of debt is a delinquent. 444 billion is seriously delinquent. That's 90 days or later, which includes some debt that has been removed from the lender's books. About 202,000 consumers had bankruptcy notations added to their credit reports in Q4 of 19, a small increase from Q4 of 2018. That was at 195,000. House debt, it was at 752 billion in newly originated mortgage debt. That was in Q4. 1% of current mortgage balances between 30 and more days of delinquency. That was in Q4 last year, near the lowest level observed in data history. About 71,000 individuals had new foreclosure notations added to their credit reports between October and December 31st. Foreclosures remain low by historic standards. A bright spot. Student loans, outstanding student loan debt stood at 1.51 trillion in Q4. That's up by 10 billion from Q3. 11.1 of aggregate student loan debt was 90 days plus delinquent or in default in Q4. Transition rates of 90 plus delinquencies was at 9.2. Accounts closing, credit inquiries, and collection accounts. The number of credit inquiries in the past 6 months, as indicator of consumer demand, was at 137 million, a small increase in the previous year. Account closings declined from 207 million closed in the past 12 months, consistent with a rate of the past 2 years. So, in other words, relative smooth sailing there, and I think it was the end of this report, left intentionally blank. Yeah, we won't get into the national charts here, but you can see sort of a picture of where consumers are in the scheme of things, called Quarterly Household Debt and Credit Report. It was, of course, released for Q4, February 2020, from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So these numbers are invaluable in what we do here. Now let's move along a little bit. We got this one out of the way. I think we'll go shale oil and its production here, and we'll find out in just a minute where it's going. But the basic situation is there in the Dakotas. The decline there in terms of where they basically are. Oh, sorry about that. We're about the wrong story here. Anyway, now to shale oil passed its peak without making money. This is an article we picked up. This is on February the 15th. By, I'm not sure who this character is, Lee Schaefer, whoever Lee Schaefer is. Anyway, stockholders of Whiting Petroleum just had a wow week. A report of potential debt repayment problem caused some volatility. Buying and selling of its shares of that trade had to be halted 5 times. Things calmed down when it became clear that the company had the money and the time to deal with the incoming debt. Whiting shares were down near an all-time low, the price less than $3 per share. Now this is quite a fall. At one time the shares were $370. That was in 2014 at the peak of the shale oil frizzy in western North Dakota. The gloom throughout the shale oil business. That was a boom in a few years ago, but big enough to be felt even in Minnesota. But it might have been the first populist boom in American history, and the reckoning is coming at this stage of the game. And this is what we want to talk about in some of these areas here. At the end of 2018, this number is a little bit old. We spent about $1 trillion in U.S. oil shale, and we got a return of about $700 billion to companies in the form of cash flow. Oh boy. That was a negative 38% cash-on-cash return. This is according to James West, partner and oil well service industry analyst for Evercore. Anyway, we had a shale business that had been massively overcapitalized. That, of course, is changing now with limited access to capital. Way too much capital went into the oil service sector, it said. Non-existent return on dollar investment had a predictive impact on a stock price. Up until 2014, the value of oil producers in the stock market were more or less tacked the price of oil, but that year was good as it got. Shale oil investors, oil production has increased since then, with last year's the biggest output so far from North Dakota, but the value of companies doing that work has mostly gone sideways or down. The return to shareholders in the sector's last decade, 10 years, effectively zero. Evercore analysts point out in January versus about 300% of the S&P 500. Meanwhile, 15 CEOs they tracked amongst oil-producing companies as a group collected $2 billion in pay. Investors and industry analysts have been demanding leaders of these companies take what have come to call the pledge, that promise that they are going to live within their means, pay back the loans, and generate market return on capital invested. Not going to happen. The industry did much better in 2017, outspending its cash flow by only a couple of percentage points rather than while spending previous years. They are all saying that they're going to be within cash flow in 2020. That we'll see. It may be a little bit hard with oil prices doing what they are doing the last couple of weeks as a main benchmark. Oil prices decline this year. And it will decline further because of COVID-19 and what is happening in Japan. The gloom in the industry isn't just about a recent slip in the prices, oil prices. It's still an opportunity to consistently pile up cash. There's been something called a fracker's dilemma. Those familiar with oil production techniques called a hydraulic fracking know that they are not really such things as drilling into the ground hoping it hits a gusher. Fracking means going into oil still in the rocks by injecting water, sand, and chemicals under high pressure to basically crack it, release the oil. Very expensive, capital intensive, and harmful to the environment. The wells can be produced for years but still get much of their output relatively soon after going into production. To keep production levels up, companies need to keep drilling new wells. That presents a tough choice there. A fairly extensive article. Once they collect the cash from selling the oil from the wells that they have been producing, do they give the money to shareholders or use it to pay back corporate debt? Well, that explains why you hear oil company executives talk about switch to manufacturing mode, or focus generating consistent production from proven fields and hoping of the kind of consistent profit margins that high volume manufacturers would produce thousands of identical products. What that means is the industry sees less exploration, and the service companies, Halliburton and Schlumberger Limited, both say that the American shale business is already past its prime. Halliburton CEO recently said 2019 marked the watershed as the shale oil business switched from growth to what they call capital discipline. Lots of small companies need to get merged out of existence or simply just go away. This is Wes again, his evaluation, and this is interesting to this whole so-called boom. The good news is that capital markets seem to be working. That is, when investor confident that these projects would work out evaporated, and capital has too. High-yield corporate bonds are still available in good operations, although most for refinancing, etc. And West, I'm really shocked if we were able to do all the equity right now. So this is some columnist here that works for the Star Tribune in Minnesota. So in other words, that is that particular situation here. Let's get to Japan. We can find Japan's somewhere here. Well, we'll eventually find it. And our Japanese friends here. Let me do a station break here and we'll get back. WBRN radio. We'll get, this is, we had our sheet here, but anyway, nonetheless, sales tax hike, destructive typhoon, again, the climate plunged Japan's economy into its biggest contraction in 5 years. Gross domestic product for the world's third largest economy shrank at annotations of 6.3 from a quarter earlier. That's according to data from the Foreign Ministry. Consumer spending fell 11.1. The national sales tax was raised 10% from 8%. That was in October, the same that the typhoon hit. Capital spending declined 14.1%. Exports slipped 0.4% due to fallout from the so-called trade war. But uncertainty on the impact of a virus outbreak has cast a shadow over the economy, especially with China's slowdown expected to worsen. It will worsen. The sharp drop in output after the October sales hike supports our view that the Japanese economy will shrink this year. Capital economists wrote a note that the data was published, but after 2 days' release, our forecast of a 0.2% drop in GDP in 2020 look optimistic. It will drop more than that, no doubt about it. And anyway, other economists warn that the virus continues to infect people, the more risk to the Japanese economy. While really GDP could rebound somewhat in January-March from a sharp decline of growth in October-February, that will not happen. The largest risk is domestic consumption, particularly with negative ripple effects on non-essential and non-urgent discretionary spending here. We expect gradual improvement. Well, maybe not. He added that the government has taken steps such as reserve funds to counter negative effects of declining inbound tourism. Also is a big case there. It has 59 confirmed cases of COVID-19, a count that doesn't include the Diamond cruise that is off of Yokohama. Anyway, that will go down. And let's see what else we have. We'll get to Nikkei in a minute here. This is Nikkei Asian Review, is where we were able to get this particular information. Let me just check here. To the Foreign Ministry we go. Snatch up some more stuff here from the ministry we had. Let me just check one other thing here very, very quickly. Well, I think we'll just append this on and we'll get it. Anyway, let's do the numbers now somewhere here. This is sometimes what happens when there is more than one operation going on here. Alright, we'll do the market here. I think the BBC, I think pretty much we'll get the same situation here. During the period, consumers spending fell. I think we already gave those numbers to you. The capital spending dropped 3.7. Exports, that we already gave that. This is from the BBC here, that what happened in Japan. And Nissan shut its factory in Japan. And let's see, they also approved $120 billion, that is 90 billion yens, aiming to cushion the impact. That was a sales tax high there. The shrink in GDP was the first move in more than a year, and the largest since 7.4 fall. That was in 2014 in Japan. Let's do the markets here now. This is from the BBC. The market was closed here. The FTSE at 26.38. That's the FTSE 100 in Amsterdam. They were at 0.110. In France, they were at 11.50. The DAX in Frankfurt was at 23.01. The Eurostar 50 at 7.99. In Madrid, they were at 25.8. And in Asia, in Bombay, they were in the negative 202.05. Hang Seng was actually up at 144. The Nikkei was down 164.35. Let me just get the reading here. Okay, this is on the 17th. In New York, the Dow was down 25.23. All right, that was the latest reading. That the Nasdaq at 19.21, and the S&P 500 at 6.22. They were all in the positive range. And let's just look at our Brent crude. Was actually down 9 cents. Actually, pretty good. These are futures, incidentally, at $57.23. West Texas Intermediate was at $52.07. It was actually up 2 cents. T-Boone Pickens ancestors jumping for joy there. And on the Forex, gold futures were up $6.35 at $1,581.40. So that's where they were, and I don't know where natural gas was. Yeah, it wasn't anywhere. So we won't even bother about natural gas here. But, yeah. We'll just put these national accounts on here, looking at some of the shrinkage here, and some of the official from Japan will append this on. I don't have it now, and don't ask me why I don't have it, but we don't have it. So, double negative coming on here. And nonetheless, this will end our report. Hopefully it is informative. We've managed to bring you up to date on China, where China is. China's GDP, at least in Q1, will continue to go down the supply chain. We'll start getting effects on Apple and these other manufacturers that have supply chains, not only there, but throughout Asia, as we go to Korea and various other people. Those economies are intertwined very closely, so we'll be seeing declines there. Now, how this will affect the American economy is very interesting. You'll hear from Chairman Powell. We don't want to forget about him. He will be up next giving his report, and he is also focused on COVID-19 as to where it will go. They're starting to do some preliminary work on it, but as with many real-time forecasting tools, the results can be have a much more negative impact than is believed at one time. We don't see any panic here. The trade situation, that is just went out of the news. Nothing on it, particularly there. As far as the job numbers in the U.S., well, we're starting to see some shedding. Wayfair, which is in Boston, they are laying off people. Some other furniture with Pier 1, they're in Texas. They're closing their stores in Canada, but they've been having problems for some time. And then, of course, you have the situation out in Seattle with Bourne's, and in Wichita with their supply chain. They have been out. People have been made redundant there, so we'll continue to monitor those factors. And those are some of the things out there that have been out there for the last 2 months or so. Manufacturing in the U.S. has been basically down. How this will affect it? Well, we look at the new plant that's in by the people at used to be called Ho Manufacturing Company. Anyway, out of China, how that will affect that. All of these things are are going to be affected. The automobile industry, as some of the parts there will be affected. So we had Q4, the end of the year. There was a lot of spending, a lot of plastic given out there. And traditionally after holidays, it would be off. But in China, the Lunar New Year is a big event. People visit their families, they give gifts, etc., and all of that. A damper was put on it. So you have people like Alibaba, they'll be down in their profits. So in other words, we'll look forward to that in our next broadcast. This is a Numbers Man, and for those in business, make the rest of the week productive. The consumer, obviously, the eye is on the prize, and on to Chairman Powell. Good day.
The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Monetary Policy and the State of the Economy. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes to give an opening statement. I'd like to welcome back Chairman Powell. As I discussed earlier and at our last hearing with you, I remain very concerned about the President's efforts to interfere with the Fed's independent monetary policy. A recent news story noted that Trump has tweeted over 100 times about the Fed since your nomination. Many of those tweets appear to be attempting to exercise pressure on the Fed. Chairman Powell, you and the Fed Board of Governors must not be swayed by these aggressive tactics. In upholding the Fed's independence, you should also be mindful of public perception. Of course, Trump continues to try to claim credit for economic growth that was put in motion by the policies of President Obama, congressional Democrats, and the Federal Reserve. His irresponsible trade war and the GOP tax scam have blown up the national debt, slowed our economic growth, and harmed hard-working American families. Trump continues to squander this inherited economy. Let me note that I am, however, disappointed in the Fed's efforts to deregulate megabanks, most recently by proposing to further roll back the Volcker Rule. The Dodd-Frank Act made our financial system safer, but it depends on agencies like the Fed to potentially use the tools available to monitor and mitigate threats to our economy. The committee is carefully monitoring the developments in the repo market and the Fed's response. The Fed should not arbitrarily reduce liquidity requirements in response to the repo market disruption, as some on Wall Street have asked for. Instead, the Fed should make appropriate adjustments to promote a well-functioning repo market while ensuring we have strong capital rules that can't be gamed through window dressing, a practice where banks alter their balance sheet to appear less risky and reduce their capital levels. In addition, the riskiness of various financial assets is increasing as climate change poses a more serious risk to our economy. The Fed and other regulators should utilize financial stability tools under Dodd-Frank, such as incorporating climate-related losses into supervisory stress tests of big banks to address this growing risk. I would also like to discuss recent developments involving the Community Reinvestment Act, that is CRA. We've had a series of hearings on this issue, and I'm very concerned about OCC Comptroller Otting's harmful proposal to turn CRA into the Community Disinvestment Act and allow banks to escape their obligation to make responsible investments in the communities where they are chartered. I urge the Fed to take a careful, deliberate approach to any changes to the implementation of the CRA and to not join Comptroller Otting's misguided efforts. Governor Brainerd's statement, and I'll quote, "It's more important to get the reforms done right than to do them quickly," quote unquote, is absolutely correct. The OCC and FDIC should heed that advice as well and extend the public comment period as community banks, state regulators, community and civil rights groups, as well as committee Democrats have called for, so that all stakeholders have an opportunity to voice their concerns. I also encourage the Fed to keep a watchful eye on Facebook's efforts to launch a cryptocurrency and digital wallet, which, as we discussed at our last hearing, could have profound implications for monetary policy and compete with our own U.S. dollar in light of the many risks Facebook's plans to create. I and other Democrats have called on Facebook to halt their plans until Congress can examine the issues associated with the big tech company developing these digital products and take action. I look forward to your testimony today, Chairman Howell, and discussing these matters. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and other members of the committee, I'm pleased to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report. My colleagues and I strongly support the goals of maximum employment and price stability that Congress has set for monetary policy. Congress has given us an important degree of independence to pursue these goals based solely on data and objective analysis. This independence brings with it an obligation to explain clearly how we pursue our goals. Today I will review the current economic situation before turning to monetary policy. The economic expansion is well into its 11th year, and it is the longest on record. Over the second half of last year, economic activity increased at a moderate pace, and the labor market strengthened further as the economy appeared resilient to the global headwinds that had intensified last summer. Inflation has been low and stable, but has continued to run below the FOMC's symmetric 2% objective. Job gains averaged 200,000 per month in the second half of last year, and an additional 225,000 jobs were added in January. The pace of job gains has remained above what is needed to provide jobs for new workers who enter the labor force, allowing the unemployment rate to move down further over the course of last year. The unemployment rate was 3.6% last month and has been near half-century lows for more than a year. Job openings remain plentiful. Employers are increasingly willing to hire workers with fewer skills and train them. As a result, the benefits of a strong labor market have become more widely shared. People who live in and work in low and middle income communities are finding new opportunities. Employment gains have been broad-based across all racial and ethnic groups and levels of education. Wages have been rising, particularly for lower-paying jobs. GDP rose at a moderate rate over the second half of last year. Growth in consumer spending moderated toward the end of the year, following earlier strong increases. But the fundamentals supporting household spending remained solid. Residential investment turned up in the second half, but business investment and exports were weak, largely reflecting sluggish growth abroad and trade developments. Those same factors weighed on activity at the nation's factories, whose output declined over the first half of 2019 and has been little changed on net since then. The February Monetary Policy Report discusses the recent weakness in manufacturing. Some of the uncertainties around trade have diminished recently, but risks to the outlook remain. In particular, we are closely monitoring the emergence of the coronavirus, which could lead to disruptions in China that spill over to the rest of the global economy. Inflation ran below the FOMC's symmetric 2% objective throughout 2019. Over the 12 months through December, overall inflation based on the price index for personal consumption expenditures was 1.6%. Core inflation, which excludes volatile food and energy prices, was also 1.6%. Over the next few months, we expect inflation to move up closer to 2%, as unusually low readings from early 2019 drop out of the 12-month calculation. The nation faces important longer-run challenges. Labor force participation by individuals in their prime working years is at its highest rate in more than a decade. However, it remains lower than in most other advanced economies, and there are troubling labor market disparities across racial and ethnic groups and across regions of the country. In addition, although it is encouraging that productivity growth, the main engine for raising wages and living standards over the longer term, has moved up recently, productivity gains have been subpar throughout this long economic expansion. Finding ways to boost labor force participation and productivity growth would benefit Americans and should remain a national priority. I will turn now to monetary policy. Over the second half of 2019, the FOMC shifted to a more accommodative stance of monetary policy to cushion the economy from weaker global growth and trade developments and to promote a faster return of inflation to our symmetric 2% objective. We lowered the federal funds target range at our July, September, and October meetings, bringing the current target range to 1.5 to 1.75%. At our subsequent meetings, with some uncertainties surrounding trade having diminished, and amid some signs that global growth may be stabilizing, the committee left the policy rate unchanged. The FOMC believes that the current stance of monetary policy will support continued economic growth, a strong labor market, and inflation returning to the committee's symmetric 2% objective. As long as incoming information about the economy remains broadly consistent with this outlook, the current stance of monetary policy will likely remain appropriate. Of course, policy is not on a preset course. If developments emerge that cause a material reassessment of our outlook, we would respond accordingly. Taking a longer view, there has been a decline over the past quarter century in the level of interest rates consistent with stable prices and the economy operating at its full potential. This low interest rate environment may limit the ability of central banks to reduce policy interest rates enough to support the economy during a downturn. With this concern in mind, we have been conducting a review of our monetary policy strategy, tools, and communication practices. Public engagement is at the heart of this effort. Through our Fed Listens events, we've been hearing from representatives of consumer, labor, business, community, and other groups. The February Monetary Policy Report shares some of what we've learned. The insights we've gained from these events have informed our framework discussions, as reported in the minutes of our meetings. We will share our conclusions when we finish the review, likely around the middle of this year. The current low interest rate environment also means that it would be important for fiscal policy to help support the economy if it weakens. Putting the federal budget on a sustainable path when the economy is strong would help ensure that policymakers have the space to use fiscal policy to assist in stabilizing the economy during a downturn. A more sustainable federal budget could also support the economy's growth over the long term. Finally, I will briefly review our planned technical operations to implement monetary policy. The February Monetary Policy Report provides details of our operations to date. Last October, the FOMC announced a plan to purchase Treasury bills and conduct repo operations. These actions have been successful in providing an ample supply of reserves to the banking system and effective control of the federal funds rate. As our bill purchases continue to build reserves toward levels that maintain ample conditions, we intend to gradually transition away from the active use of repo operations. Also, as reserves reach durably ample levels, we intend to slow our purchases to a pace that will allow our balance sheet to grow in line with trend demand for our liabilities. All of these technical measures support the efficient and effective implementation of monetary policy. They are not intended to represent a change in the stance of monetary policy. As always, we stand ready to adjust the details of our technical operations as conditions warrant. Thank you. I look forward to discussion.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. In December 2019, when the OCC and FDIC issued a notice of proposed rulemaking on comptroller Auding's proposal, the Federal Reserve did not join this proposal. FDIC board member Martin Gruenberg voted against Comptroller Auding's proposal, describing it as, quote, a deeply misconceived proposal that would fundamentally undermine and weaken the Community Reinvestment Act, quote, unquote. And in remarks last month, Federal Reserve Board Governor Brainerd said that, quote, given that reforms to the CRA regulations are likely to set expectations for a few decades, it is more important to get the reforms done right than to do them quickly. That requires giving external stakeholders sufficient time and analysis to provide meaningful feedback on a range of options for modernizing the regulations, unquote. Chair Powell, Governor Brainerd also suggested in a speech last month that the Federal Reserve created a database of 6,000 public CRA evaluations looking at how various CRA investments support low and moderate income communities. Has the Fed used this database to evaluate how bank activities would be assessed under the OCC's and the FDIC's proposal for CRA?
If I understood your question, it was whether we've used our database to evaluate their proposal.
That's right.
I'm not totally sure we have. Maybe I can provide a little context, if that's appropriate, if I may, which is just that we do agree that this is a good time to update CRA in light of changing technology and demographics, and we agree on the goals. We put a lot of work into this. We tried hard to get on the same page. We weren't able to do that. We have some different ideas.
Does the Fed intend to do this assessment?
Excuse me?
Do you intend to do the assessment that I referenced regarding the database to evaluate bank activities? And how they would be assessed under the OCC's and FDIC's proposal for CRA? Well,
so the real point of that database was for us to create our own set of metrics. We want to be very, very sure that what comes out of this is a proposal that from us that will leave all major participants in CRA better off. And so we think it's important that each metric, each change that we make is grounded in data. And that was the purpose, was to help us develop our thinking and our proposals, and that's essentially what we've been using it for.
So given the magnitude of reform in CRA regulations, do you think the comment period should be extended to allow the public to weigh in on such an important undertaking?
That's really a decision for the OCC and the FDIC.
Well, I know it's a decision of yours, Mr. Powell, but what do you think?
I think it's not our role to comment on their proposal. We have our own work and our own ideas that we'd be happy to share, but it's really up to them to make that decision.
So are you completing your assessment? Are you continuing to look until you come to a final decision?
We are.
Well, don't you think the public should have an opportunity to have more time to do that also?
And they will when the time comes. I mean, I think for the time being, what we're doing is we are looking forward to reading the comments on the proposal. I think we'll all learn quite a lot from those comments, and we'll be able to incorporate that thinking and whatever changes are made to the proposal. There may be substantial changes to the existing proposal coming out of the comments. So I think our view is that we want something that will leave everybody better off and will have broad support. And that's what we're going to be working on.
Well, as you may be aware, all of the Democrats on this committee urge regulators to provide a public comment period of at least 120 days on any major CRA reform instead of the 60 days the OCC and FDIC has provided. Community banks, state regulators, and community groups have called on these agencies to extend the comment period. And even though you said it is not your place to comment on whether or not this should be extended, I wish you would think about this, and I wish you would, as you're doing the assessment, and as you have said, it is important for the public to be able to comment, review what you are thinking, and if you change your mind, let us know about commenting on whether or not we should extend the comment period. You don't have to respond to that. Thank you very much. The gentleman from North Carolina.
For the minimum wage increases, states that have had minimum wage increases have seen, there's a noticeably higher increase, but really it's much broader than that. And the bigger factor really just is very low unemployment and a strong labor market, high job creation. That's the main driver.
So the other concern that I have, because it also seems as though, as unemployment goes lower, et cetera, it's still, when you look at black unemployment, it still remains nearly double that of white unemployment. And it seems to stay that way whether the cycle is a down cycle or an up cycle. So are there any signs of how we close those gaps? I mean, because there's always these gaps that seems to happen between the African-American community and whites, where even though it's good economy, that gap stays the same.
There are persistent gaps, and they're very troubling, and they're not in the long run something that monetary policy can address. It really is up to other policies by governments, state and local governments, the federal government, and frankly businesses too, to do what they can to close that gap. What we have is an interest rate tool, and what we can do is support the goals you've given us, maximum employment and stable prices. We see positive effects from that, but over the longer run, it really needs broader policies of education and other things that would help with that issue.
Okay, let me ask, I know Chairwoman Waters asked some questions on CRA. There were some questions that came up that maybe you can answer. The framework that was put forward by Governor Brainard not too long ago, is that the same framework of the Federal Reserve Board? Is it just some are saying it's just her opinion and it's not that of the board? Is it so? Maybe you can clear it up. Does the board see it similarly as Governor Brainard?
So we actually haven't taken a proposal to the board yet, but no, that represents the thinking of that she's been working on this. I asked her to lead this effort for us. She was the head of that committee for some time. I'm very comfortable with the thinking that's in that speech, and support that set of ideas and that approach. But it's not at a place where we can say this is a proposal from the Fed because we haven't taken it to the board yet.
Thank you.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Successfully ensured, enough well-paying jobs are available to everyone who wants to work, even for a small time. In a 1944 address, FDR called for a second Bill of Rights, which included the right to a useful and financially rewarding job. Justice Thurgood Marshall argued that the right to a job is secured by the 14th Amendment. And Dr. Martin Luther King called on the government to guarantee a job to all people who want to work and are able to work. Dr. King's legacy is often reduced to just one speech, and the March on Washington often mischaracterized. The March on Washington was actually the March on Washington for jobs and freedoms. It was a march for economic justice. And I take special claim to the fact that Dr. King and Coretta actually met in Boston. I represent Boston, and I don't think that she gets enough oxygen for the role that she played in the movement. And so after Dr. King's assassination, Coretta Scott King picked up the mantle, pushing the Fed to adopt a full employment mandate, and was actually standing behind President Carter as he signed the Humphrey-Hawkins Act into law, and that's the reason that you are here today. So in the interest of time, if you would indulge me and answer as succinctly as possible, yes or no, Mr. Chairman, given persistent concerns about inflation, do you believe the Federal Reserve can achieve full employment? And by full employment, I mean anyone who wants to work and can work will have a job available to them.
First, thank you for that history. I didn't know that. So that's our goal. That's what we're working to do at all times. And I think we're never going to say we've accomplished that goal, but we've certainly made some progress.
I'll take that as a yes. Could a federal jobs guarantee succeed where the Federal Reserve has not? Yes or no?
That's a hard one to answer. You mean by, I don't know.
Guaranteeing a job. That's the history that I was providing. That anyone who wants to work and is able to work.
To the fiscal authorities on that.
So, Chairman Powell, by all indications, the U.S. economy has had output well below potential for 8 of the past 10 years, and for most of the decade prior. Is it true that most of that period has seen unemployment well above target, while we almost never seen inflation above target?
That is true.
Okay. So, meanwhile, black unemployment remains double that of white unemployment. Now, the Fed began raising rates in 2016, even though inflation was still below target. And when rates go up, unemployment tends to as well. Did the Fed consider how raising rates would disproportionately impact those who are already struggling to secure employment, like communities of color, individuals who were formerly incarcerated, our immigrant neighbors?
So I would say that unemployment has continued to go down quite significantly since we began to raise rates at the end of 2016, actually the end of 15.
But again, did the Fed consider how raising rates would disproportionately impact those who were already struggling to secure employment?
I think our consideration was really that the right thing to do was to get monetary policy back toward a place where it reflected an economy that had recovered quite a bit for the benefit of all people, including low and moderate income people, including minorities.
There are a lot of people still recovering. But in the interest of time, given that there have been no signs of the economy overheating since then, and you're now cutting rates, is it possible you began cutting rates too soon?
I think history will judge that. We have to make the decisions in real time. We really have learned something since then, and that is that unemployment can be lower than most people thought without inflation.
So bearing that in mind, knowing what you know, would you still have supported raising the interest rates when the Fed did?
I did support it then, and hindsight's 20/20. I think you have to judge those decisions on what we knew at the time.
Would more Americans have jobs today if the Fed had not increased rates over the past 3 years?
I don't know. We're at a 50-year low. It's a fair question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to thank Chairman Powell for his testimony today. Without objection, all members have found.
Why has the Fed not been so direct? And do you have plans to set clear goals and guidelines for your regulated institutions?
Yes, we will do that at some point. You may have seen that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have said that they won't accept LIBOR referencing mortgages after some point later this year. So that sort of thing will begin to happen now, I think, well in advance of the deadline, which is the end of 2021.
Okay, and Chairman Powell, your Fed board recently finalized its rule on tailoring the hopes of providing more clear and well-defined risk indicators to determine the regulatory requirements that are placed on firms based on their size and risk. But the board has never disclosed nor provided clear and quantitative criteria under which firms are placed under its enhanced supervisory regime that is called Large Institutions Supervision Coordinating Committee. And even your vice chairman, Mr. Quarles, recently gave a speech where he said this. He said that he would like to align their portfolio with the tailoring categories and make the designation criterion transparent. And you even recently indicated that you agreed on the need for brighter lines. So could you outline what changes the Ford is considering to make in this supervisory framework?
We're just in the process of working out the specifics, but I would agree that we should provide more clarity around what is a LISIC firm, and that's really going to be the Category 1 firms.
Thank you. Now, let's move to, and you're a great man, a good friend. I respect you tremendously. But Chairman Powell, the Fed is the axle of our financial system. You are the most powerful regulator. And I want you to stand back up to Mr. Otting on this business of him coming with this rule-making change to the Community Reinvestment Act. Let him know that you not only have a mandate for inflationary monetary policy, you have a dual mandate, employment, jobs. And here's the other thing. You need to remind Mr. Otting that this piece of legislation, this law, the Community Reinvestment Act, is precious to the nation, but it's precious to African Americans more than anybody, because it wasn't the Civil Rights Act, wasn't the Voting Rights Act that dealt with the big issue facing African Americans, financial stability. And the two anchors for that is a home, owning a house, and having a job. And this bill was the bill that outlined redlining that kept African Americans out. He needs to back off of that. You need to assume your power in this and let him know we're serious and to back off this rule change.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate you.
The last FMOC press conference that you were a bit surprised that wages have failed to move up despite being well into an expanding economy. Sustained levels of historically low unemployment and increased labor force participation. Fundamentals are strong. Strong, yet nearly half, 42.4%, of working Americans in 2019 made less than $15 an hour. Fundamentals are strong. Good many of the people in my congressional district, Mr. Powell, are more concerned about the supermarket prices than the stock market. When they go to the supermarket, they're concerned about the price of Procter & Gamble products, not the stock market price of Procter & Gamble itself. The stock market means nothing to them. It's what they have to pay for products in the supermarket. This brings me to my question. Has there been a study to give us some sense of what a $15 an hour wage will do for the economy? A study for what a $15 an hour wage will do for the economy. Has the Fed done such a study?
The Fed has not. That's not something we would do.
Well, let me just address that, if I may. Don't mean to be rude, crude, and unrefined, but let me just call to your attention a study that I found quite interesting. The Carbon Disclosure Project. Good project. Based on thousands of disclosures, you've concluded that the 500 largest companies by market capitalization are exposed to $1 trillion in risk. Now, someone could argue that that's probably not something that you ought to do, although I understand that climate change is something that is important to the Fed because it will have an impact, global impact. But I think you can take a closer look at this. You're the ultimate authority on price stability, on wages. Let's have a study to determine what impact a $15 an hour minimum wage will have on the economy. A wage disclosure project, if you will. Give me some thoughts, Mr. Powell. Can you help us, please?
There's a great deal of research that's been done on minimum wages, and I don't know of a particular one, but there has to be somewhere research on what a federal $15 wage increase.
And I agree with you. I agree. I've read a few. But they don't come from the Fed. They don't come from the entity that has the dual mandate, price stability, unemployment or employment. It would mean something to working people if we could get such a study, notwithstanding what others have done. And these are observations, Mr. Powell, not criticisms. I've enjoyed visiting with you. Notwithstanding what others have done, this would be meaningful to working people. By the way, I think $15 an hour is not enough as a minimum wage. I think it ought to be at least 20 now, but I'll still settle for 15 if we can get that. So can we work with you, discuss with you the possibility of a wage project?
I'll go back and talk to our labor people who know this issue very, very well, and many of them have published on these issues. So let me come back and.
I'm going to thank you for it. I've got 46 seconds, and I'm going to applaud you for it. Personal applause. Madam Chair, with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much.
When you look at, many folks don't work a full-time job, but they have a wage. So could we be a little more creative in looking at the data based on what some of the things that I'm hearing from the group that came in? And I'm sure they've met with your folks and you know some of their issues. So I'll start with 2. Can it be localized? Can we entertain looking at some of the things that they think we should look at when we calculate or present all the good news that is not the good news for many of the individuals sitting here or in my district?
I think you're probably making some of our data people very happy back at the Board of Governors.
Okay.
They love to cut the data different ways, and we do learn every time we do that. We learn things. I don't actually know the precise answer to your question of whether we can do it regionally or in what dimensions we can, but we'd be happy to look into that for you.
And what about some of the individuals' ideas about looking at wages in your calculation?
Yes, we can. I think we can do that. I think
so. Your folks would be willing to work with them on some of the ideas to at least start at a starting point of discussing it. Because now we're marrying the people with the power, and what a good win-win that would be for all of us, since we're really talking about all of our lives, and especially those who, have to work a little harder than some of the rest of us. And so then the next thing, will your agency work with my office? I am so excited about this bill, and as I understand it, part of the reason for asking for the data is the Federal Reserve actually collects the data that sets the policies that then get married with the allocations that come back to the districts. So I want to make sure I'm on the right path when I go back home and I say I have a bill that's asking the Federal Reserve to collect data that can help us in the end. Is that in the ballpark?
We should actually get the experts to talk directly to you and your staff and tell you what we do and how we do it and how that might be useful. I don't know that we need legislation at all, but we certainly have excellent sources of data, and we do cut them different ways. So why don't we just try to follow up with you on that?
Thank you.
Gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Tipton, is recognized for 5 minutes.